Hello, and welcome to Section 3 of Chapter 1 for AP Psychology, Chapter 1 on what is psychology. Today we're examining critical and scientific thinking in psychology. So let's get into it, because you're probably thinking why you're here, and you're deeply thinking, and why, what's the meaning of life? I'm just messing with you. So the book definition of critical thinking is the ability and willingness to assess claims and make objective judgments on the basis of well-supported reasons and evidence rather than emotion or anecdote. That's hard. Um, it's not just negative thinking, like, oh, you're so critical. It's not that. It's looking for alternative solutions, explanations. Summed up very easily, it's a deliberate thought process. Not just accepting things as they are, looking for evidence, comparing two sides, trying to get to the bottom of it, and really understanding things in depth. And so it's fundamental to all science, it's fundamental to pretty much all academics, critical thinking. It's probably one of the skills that we need to teach more and more throughout our society is, how to think and how to think critically, not just to accept and go, yeah, that's true. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, fake news, whatever. There are 8 essential critical thinking guidelines, which we're going to get into today. And critical thinking is looking at things from a different point of view. So Iron Man, yes, he's Iron Man. I mean, he's awesome. He saved, the planet, the universe, but he irons too. See, critical thinking. So first, ask questions. An inquisitive mind is essential to be a critical thinker, and children are the best at this. They ask thousands of questions. In fact, they've done studies that show that children ask far more questions than adults, and adults get annoyed because sometimes they don't have the right answers to all these. Be willing to wonder, to be curious, to inquire. Why are things happening? We got Curious George here dressed as the Joker. Why so curious? Why so curious? Define your terms. Frame it in clear and concrete terms. We're getting very scientific here. And then form a hypothesis. Let's test this out. I think that this is going to happen this way based on my initial evidence, my initial observations, and we're going to test it. Now, in psychology, you have to have operational definitions, which now we're getting kind of complicated here, but they have to be specific. For instance, if you're wanting to do a study on how sleep affects achievement in school, so you observe that people that sleep more seem to do well in school, and those that don't sleep well, or they stay up all night playing video games or making TikToks or whatever, they don't do as well. So your hypothesis would be that I believe students who sleep more achieve better. You have to define the operations, because that, generally speaking, time slept and achievement, you could have vastly different studies based on how you define your terms. For instance, you might look at the number of minutes slept and then their correlational GPAs. If they sleep more minutes, their GPAs go up. Somebody else might look at the number of hours slept, which are defining different terms of minutes, and their SAT scores. So depending on how you define your operations, that kind of determines, the study. You need to examine the evidence. Accepting the conclusion without evidence is simply lazy thinking, and you shouldn't expect others to do so as well. The old "because I said so" from your parents, that's lazy. They need to give you an explanation. They give you a valid reason, which, sometimes parents get fed up and don't want to do that. You analyze assumptions and biases. We all have built-in bias. We all have assumptions that we're not even aware of a lot of times. An assumption is a belief that you're taken for granted. Biases are assumptions that keep us from considering the evidence fairly or cause us to ignore some evidence entirely. I already gave you some bias and assumptions in the last slide when I talked about people playing video games, staying up all night doing TikToks. You know what? Maybe somebody's up because they're studying. They're reviewing the materials. They're rewriting their notes, and so that is an assumption that if you stay up late, that you're wasting your time, and that kind of shows a little bit of bias, because I have an 11-year-old son. He's almost 12, and he plays a lot of video games, and so you can kind of see those things coming out. There is the principle of falsifiability. It's a hard word to say. That basically your hypothesis could be disproved with new evidence. And a failed hypothesis isn't a failed experiment or a failed study. It's added to the body of knowledge. And so it's okay that your hypothesis can be disproved. Critical thinkers must challenge their own assumptions too. And so that's kind of critical to do so. So with the principle of falsifiability, there's also the idea that anything that cannot be proven false is actually pseudoscience or not worthy of scientific study. The example, does God exist, cannot be disproven, so it's not up for scientific study. An example of this is the theory of gravity. For centuries, from Isaac Newton, was held to be, pretty bulletproof. There was no holes they could shoot in. All the measurements worked. But then Einstein came along with the theory of relativity and all that, and then you have space travel, and they figured out that, hey, gravity's not absolute. It's different on the moon, it's different on Mercury, it's different in space. And so it's kind of the idea that it can be disproven, so it is science. People need to avoid emotional rationing. Disagreeing is fine, but consider why you're disagreeing. Many people get, they get personally attached to certain things. That's why we're not supposed to talk about religion and politics, because we're emotionally attached to these things, and they don't really lend themselves for critical thinking because our emotions cloud our judgment. If you're being illogical or emotional, it means you're really not thinking straight. Don't oversimplify. The History Channel loves to say, hey, it's aliens. I'm not saying it's aliens, but it was aliens. Look beyond the obvious, either or thinking, the easy explanation. The problem in America today, liberals, immigrants, gun-toting rednecks, you name it. That's oversimplifying the problem. Argument by anecdote. Well, my grandson, he was like this, so psychology is wrong. You can't, because there's always exceptions. You can't generalize based on personal examples. That's an anecdote. Or a few examples that you maybe heard or you saw on Facebook. Well, so-and-so said this on Facebook. Consider other interpretations. The goal is to arrive at a theory which can be disproven. That is science. And then also tolerate uncertainty. There's certain things we just don't know. Avoid coming to firm conclusions until researchers have repeated the experiment. Good science is someone can replicate your experiment and either prove or disprove your ideas and your hypothesis and your findings. And so science needs to be repeated to kind of make sure there's a body of evidence. And then also there's some times that we just don't know. Just like there is no theory of evolution, it's just a list of creatures that Chuck Norris has allowed to live. That's all I have for today. If you have any questions, let me know. Hope you enjoyed this.